7 military dogs. One word. Complete silence. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to matter, and when the armed handlers raised their weapons and Lieutenant Ethan Cole pointed at the door, Mara Bennett didn't flinch, not even a little. Just looked at the dogs. All 7 of them, circling her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world, Ethan shouted. The handlers pulled, the dogs didn't move. Then Mara opened her mouth, said one word in a voice barely above a whisper, and every single military animal dropped to the floor like they'd been waiting their whole lives for that sound. Nobody in that corridor could explain what they'd just witnessed. Nobody except her. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where I want you. Follow along until the very end. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching. I want to see just how far this story travels. The dogs were what Mara noticed first. Not the uniforms. Not the armed handlers posted at either end of the restricted corridor. Not the cold fluorescent hum of Harwick International Airport's secured transit wing, which was the kind of place that made you feel surveilled even when you were doing nothing wrong. She noticed the dogs because she always noticed the dogs. It was a reflex, so old it had stopped feeling like a choice. There were 7 of them. Belgian Malinois mostly, with one German Shepherd at the rear, moving with a slight hitch in his left hip that someone had probably written off as a bad angle on a form somewhere. They were in transit harnesses, leashed in pairs, and they should have been walking clean beside their handlers. They weren't. 3 of the dogs were pulling at oblique angles, noses working hard, heads swiveling toward the left side of the corridor, toward the civilian waiting area, toward Mara in a way that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition. She slowed her walk. The handler nearest to her, young specialist who looked like he'd been doing this job for maybe 18 months, yanked his dog's lead sharply. The Malinois swung back into line for exactly 4 steps, then started drifting again. Mara kept her pace even, her carry-on bag rolling behind her, her airport ID badge clipped to the lanyard at her chest. She was technically on the wrong side of a restricted corridor because a gate attendant had waved her through a maintenance access door to avoid a delayed security line, which happened sometimes at Harwick when the main terminal was backed up. She had a connecting flight to catch. She was not trying to be in a classified military transport wing. She was very much not trying to stand in front of 7 working military dogs. The shepherd at the rear stopped walking entirely. His handler, older, more experienced, with the flat-set jaw of someone who'd been doing canine work in hard conditions, issued a sharp correction command. The dog sat. Then, as if reconsidering, the shepherd stood again, turned toward Mara, and made a sound that wasn't a bark. It was lower than that, softer. Something that handlers who'd spent their whole careers in conventional training programs would not have a clean name for. Mara recognized it. She stopped walking. That was her first mistake, from Lieutenant Ethan Cole's perspective, because Ethan Cole was standing 12 feet ahead of her, near the operations checkpoint, and he had been watching the dogs getting progressively more difficult to manage for the past 4 minutes. And the last thing he needed was a civilian woman in civilian clothes stopping in the middle of a restricted corridor and staring at his K9 unit like she was reading something the rest of them couldn't see. Ma'am. His voice carried the particular quality of authority that gets trained into junior officers, loud enough to command attention, clipped enough to suggest he didn't expect to have to repeat himself. This is a restricted corridor. You need to exit through the door behind you. Mara glanced at him. Just a glance. The way you'd acknowledge someone calling your name from across a parking lot, aware of them, not alarmed by them. I know, she said. Gate attendant routed me through by mistake. I'm not trying to be here. Then you can walk back out the way you came. Can't. She didn't move yet, because the shepherd at the rear of the formation had now drawn 2 of the Malinois into his behavioral orbit. All 3 dogs angled toward her with that same low-focused energy, and she was doing a fast calculation in her head about what would happen if she turned and walked away from 7 high-drive working dogs who had just locked onto her scent and posture signature. Can I ask how long the dogs have been in transit? Ethan's expression shifted. Not much. But the shift was there. That's not information I'm going to share with a civilian in a restricted corridor. I'm asking because 3 of them are showing early conflict behaviors, and 1 is compensating for physical discomfort he's been trained not to display. And if they've been in transport long enough without a proper decompression break, the next 20 minutes could be difficult for your handlers. Pause. Not a long one, but long enough. One of the handlers, the young specialist with the pulling Malinois, cut a glance at his dog, then at Ethan, then back at the dog. Who are you? Ethan asked. Mara Bennett. I'm a trauma nurse at Callaway Regional. I have a connecting flight to Portland. She lifted her badge slightly. I genuinely ended up here by accident, then you should genuinely leave. She looked at the dogs again. All 7 were unsettled now, a restless shimmer moving through the formation the way wind moves through tall grass, not chaos yet, but the thing that comes before chaos if you know what you're looking for. Okay, she said. She turned. The shepherd at the rear made that sound again, low, urgent, particular vocalization that is not a bark and not a whine, but something that sits precisely between the two, and then he did something that Ethan Cole would later describe in his incident report with visible difficulty, because it was not the kind of thing that fit neatly into standard military dog behavior documentation. The shepherd pulled free, not violently, not a lunge. His handler had him on a short lead and a proper grip, but the dog pulled forward with that specific quality of determination that working dogs reserve for things they have decided matter more than any command currently in their system, a smooth, sustained forward pressure that the handler hadn't anticipated because it didn't look like a threat display. It looked like a dog trying to get to something he was supposed to get to. The lead went taut. The handler corrected. The dog sat, but he kept his eyes on Mara with an intensity that made 2 of the nearest handlers step back slightly without entirely meaning to. Then the other dog started. Not in the same way, it wasn't synchronized, not at first. But within 90 seconds of the shepherd's break, 4 of the 7 Malinois had shifted their body language from controlled working posture to that particular high alert state that civilian observers often misread as aggression and experienced handlers recognize as something more complicated, dogs registering a profound signal conflict between their current commands and something much older in their training architecture. Hold your positions, Ethan said to the handlers. His voice was still controlled, but there was an edge under it now, thin as a wire. He turned to Mara. Ma'am, I need you to exit this corridor. Now, I understand. I'm trying to tell you that walking away from them right now may not be the best option. You're a nurse, yes. Then you don't have a working knowledge of military canine behavior, and I'm asking you for the last time to exit before this situation escalates. She met his eyes. It's already escalating. He took a step toward her. Can have you detained. The shepherd pulled again. This time the handler went forward with him 2 full steps before catching his balance, and the sudden movement rippled through the formation like a current 2-2 Malinois surged. A third spun on its lead, and the young specialist's dog made a sharp vocalization that bounced off the corridor walls and came back too loud, too sharp, the kind of sound that raises every heart rate in an enclosed space. Ethan turned back to his handlers. Hold them. Hold. Lieutenant. A new voice from behind the checkpoint. Report. The woman who stepped through the checkpoint door moved the way people move when they have spent years in environments where the wrong step costs something significant. She was in her mid-40s, a compact build, service ribbons on her chest, and eyes that did a rapid environmental assessment of the corridor in approximately 3 seconds. Major Rebecca Shaw wore the insignia of a scene's canine commander, and the handlers responded to her presence the way people respond to gravity, almost without noticing. They stood straighter. Shaw took in the corridor, the 7 unsettled dogs. The handlers working to hold them. Ethan with his jaw set and his hand hovering near a decision he hadn't made yet. And Mara, standing completely still in the middle of all of it, carry-on bag still rolling behind her, making no sudden movements, watching the dogs with an expression that Shaw would later describe as the quietest thing in the room. What is the status of the unit? Shaw asked. Formation disrupted by an unauthorized civilian in the restricted corridor, Ethan said. I've ordered her to exit. Shaw looked at Mara. You're the disruption? Apparently. What's your name? Mara Bennett. What are you doing in this corridor? Mara Bennett. Wrong door. Gate attendant error. I have a connecting flight. Shaw studied her for a moment. Not a casual study, a thorough one. The kind of look that takes inventory. She noted the posture, still, centered. No backward lean despite being surrounded by agitated military animals. She noted the hands, loose at the sides, not white-knuckling the carry-on handle. She noted the eyes, moving between the dogs in a pattern that was not the random scanning of a frightened civilian, but a deliberate sequence, one animal to the next, like reading a room. She noted the scars on Mara's right hand, faint, old, but specific, the particular linear marks that come from working with high-drive dogs in live training scenarios over a long period of time. Shaw filed that away. She needs to exit, Ethan said. The dogs are responding to her presence. I can see that. Shaw kept her eyes on Mara. Why are they responding to her presence? I don't know, ma'am. Claims to be a civilian nurse. I am a civilian nurse, Mara said. Currently, Shaw's head tilted slightly. Currently. Lieutenant, stand down, Shaw said. I'll handle this. Ethan's expression flickered. He didn't like it, but he stepped back. Shaw walked toward Mara with the measured pace of someone who has learned that rushing into an animal situation almost always makes it worse. How long have you been in the corridor? Shaw asked. Maybe 8 minutes. When did the dog start responding to you? About 30 seconds after I slowed down. The shepherd at the rear picked me up first. I see the hip, has been bothering him. Compensating well, but he's tired. They're all tired. How long have they been in transit? Shaw paused. It was the second time someone in civilian clothes had asked that question, and it was starting to feel less like coincidence. 11 hours, lay over here before the final leg. They haven't had a proper decompression break. We had a scheduled rest period at the stopover, but there were security complications. Mara nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. They're not responding to me because I'm a disruption. They're responding because they recognize something about me, and their handlers are giving them commands that conflict with that recognition, which is creating the escalation you're seeing now. Shaw was quiet for a moment. What would they be recognizing? Mara looked at her steadily. A command presence from a protocol they were conditioned to early in their training. Corridor was loud, with the sounds of 7 unsettled dogs, the shuffle and shift of paws, the low vocalizations, the strain of leads going taut. But in the 6 inches between Mara and Shaw, the air had gone very quiet. What protocol? Shaw asked. Mara didn't answer that. Not then. Instead, she looked past Shaw at the handlers, who were working hard and working well, but were clearly losing the incremental battle of attention. The dogs were present in body and increasingly absent in focus, their heads swiveling toward Mara every time a handler's correction loosened even slightly. Let me talk to them, Mara said. Absolutely not, Ethan said from behind Shaw. Ma'am, with respect, we don't know who this person is. Outrank you. Lieutenant, Shaw said, without turning around. Then to Mara, if you approach them and it goes wrong, we have a serious incident in a public transit facility. I know. You're willing to accept that responsibility? I'm saying it won't go wrong. Shaw looked at her hands. At the way she was still standing in the midst of 7 agitated military dogs, like she was standing in an empty room. The scars on her right hand that said something her airport badge did not. What did you mean by currently? Shaw asked quietly. Mara met her eyes. I mean, I'm a nurse now. I wasn't always. Shaw made a decision. The kind that senior commanders make when they've run out of better options, and the situation is actively degrading, not a comfortable decision, not one that would look clean in a report, but the right one. Handlers, hold your positions. Don't correct unless there's a physical safety issue. She looked at Mara. Show me. Ethan made a sound that was not quite a word. Mara set her carry-on bag against the corridor wall, unhurried, the way you'd set it down before sitting on a park bench. Then she turned to face the formation, and she was still entirely still, and she did not move toward the dogs or make any invitation gesture, or crouch down in the way that people crouch down when they're trying to make themselves approachable. She just stood, and she waited. The shepherd was the first. Strained forward again, not violently, and his handler let the lead play out slightly, because Shaw had said hold unless there's a physical safety issue, and the dog's body language had shifted from agitation into something that the handler didn't have a word for, but that felt somehow like relief. The shepherd covered the distance to Mara in 6 steps and sat in front of her so precisely, so perfectly square, that 3 of the handlers involuntarily straightened up. It was not a dog presenting himself to a stranger. It was a dog reporting to someone he knew. Good, Mara said very quietly. She didn't reach out. She didn't need to. I see you. The remaining 6 dogs went through a visible shift, something that moved through them like a wave, the high-drive restlessness settling, the conflict tension draining, and one by one, without instruction from their handlers, they oriented to Mara. Not aggressively, not unpredictably, in the ordered, deliberate way of animals responding to a signal they have been waiting for. Ethan watched with his jaw tight and his hands doing nothing useful. The young specialist with the pulling Malinois realized his dog had stopped pulling for the first time in 20 minutes, and he looked down at the animal, and then up at Mara, and he looked like someone who had just seen a card trick and could not locate the mechanism. Shaw said nothing. She was watching Mara's hands. Then one of the rear Malinois, a female with a diagonal scar above her left eye, battle-marked from something Shaw hadn't been briefed on, yet made a low sound and shifted her weight. Agitation creeping back in, not toward Mara. Something residual, some discomfort in the body that the travel had ground in and the decompression brake hadn't cleared. Mara heard it. She turned her head slightly toward the female dog and said one word. One word. Shaw heard it, but did not catch it. It was in a cadence and register she didn't recognize. Not English. Not a standard command language. Some things that sounded almost like it had been constructed rather than borrowed. Every dog dropped, not fell. Dropped in the controlled, deliberate way of animals executing a command they knew in their bones. All 7 Malinois and the shepherd going from standing to a full down stay in a movement that was so synchronized it didn't look real. Noses on the corridor floor, haunches flat, leads going slack for the first time in 40 minutes. The handlers stood with their leads in their hands and their mouths slightly open. Ethan said nothing. He couldn't. Shaw stood very still for a long moment, looking at 7 military dogs lying flat and calm on the floor of a restricted airport corridor, and at the woman who had just put them there with one word in a language she did not recognize. Then she looked at the scars on Mara's right hand, and at the way Mara was standing, the posture of someone who has done this 1,000 times, and is not surprised by any of it, and something locked into place in Shaw's mind. Piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was working on. "What program were you in?" Shaw asked. Her voice was very controlled. Mara looked at her for a moment. "That's classified," she said. Shaw nodded slowly. "I know." And the way she said it suggested she was not asking because she didn't know. She was asking because she wanted to know if Mara would say it. Behind them, Ethan had taken out his radio. The young specialist was still looking at his dog, who was lying at his feet with his chin on the floor and his eyes tracking Mara with the calm, attentive devotion of an animal that has found the center of its compass. Down the corridor, through the frosted glass of the transit wing's secure observation room, someone had stopped moving. Someone in a different uniform, with a different kind of authority, watching through the glass, with an expression that had shifted several times in the last 2 minutes and had not yet settled back into anything comfortable. Mara was looking at the dogs. All 7 of them, quiet at last, their breathing evening out. She had a connecting flight to Portland. She was very much not going to make it. Portland flight left without her at 4:47 p.m. Mara knew because she heard the boarding announcement over the corridor's intercom system, muffled and distant, like something happening in another life. She didn't move. The dogs were still in their downstay, breathing slowly, and disrupting that right now would have been the wrong call. So she stood where she was and let the flight go, and if she felt anything about it, she kept it off her face. Shaw had moved to the far end of the corridor near the checkpoint and was on her phone. Not a radio, a phone, which meant she was calling someone who wasn't in the building. Ethan was standing 7 feet away from Mara, with his arms crossed and his jaw working like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. The handlers had taken up loose positions around their dogs, doing the math on the situation the same way junior personnel always do, quietly, without showing it, watching the people above them for cues. "You can sit down," Mara said to no one in particular. Ethan looked at her. "Excuse me, not you." She nodded toward the dogs. "Talking to them." He stared at her for a moment, like he was trying to decide if she was making a joke at his expense. She wasn't. She gave the dogs a small release signal, just a shift in her posture, nothing theatrical, and 3 of the Malinois moved from flat down stay to a more relaxed side-lying position, heads still up, still attentive, but no longer holding the full tension of a formal command. One of the handlers exhaled audibly. "They've been holding that position for 11 hours in various configurations," Mara said. "Their backs hurt, especially the shepherd." "They're working dogs," Ethan said. "They're trained to hold position." "Trained to hold it, yes. Doesn't mean it doesn't cost them." She looked at him steadily. "Same as people." Ethan didn't respond to that. He pulled out his radio instead and spoke into it in the clipped language of someone making an official log entry, getting the timeline straight while the timeline was still fresh. She heard her name, her flight number, the phrase "civilian interference," which she noted and did not react to. The young specialist, she had picked up his name from a brief exchange between him and another handler, Decker. Specialist Decker was crouched near his Malinois now, fingers working gently at the dog's shoulder harness to check fit. The dog's name, she'd gathered, was Rook. Rook was lying on his side with his eyes half closed, the travel tension finally out of his body, and Decker was looking at him with the expression of someone who had been worried for a while and was only now starting to admit it. "He okay?" Decker asked, low, not quite aimed at anyone. Mara answered anyway. "He's decompressing. He'll be better in 20 minutes. She paused. "Make sure he drinks before you load him again." Decker looked up at her. He was young enough that he hadn't learned yet to keep his face neutral when he was surprised. "How did you use tongue?" "The way he's holding his mouth. He's more dehydrated than the others." Decker looked at Rook's mouth. Then he reached for his water kit without another word. Ethan watched this exchange and did not look pleased that it had happened, which was its own kind of information. Shaw came back from the checkpoint. She had put her phone away, and her face had settled into something that was professionally composed, but not quite as flat as it had been 10 minutes ago. There was a calculation happening behind her eyes that she hadn't finished yet, and it was making her careful. "Bennett," Shaw said. "Walk with me." Mara followed her to the corridor's narrow side alcove, the kind of recessed space that exists in transit wings for operational discussions that don't need an audience. Ethan started to follow. Shaw gave him a look that stopped him at 7 paces. "Just the two of us," Shaw said. He stopped. He did not hide how much he didn't like it. In the alcove, Shaw stood with her back to the corridor and spoke quietly. "I made some calls, I figured." Mara Bennett, registered nurse, Callaway Regional Medical Center, Trauma Unit. Prior to that, 18 months at St. Carrick's in Denver. Shaw paused. "Before that, your record has a gap." "I know, a gap of approximately 8 years. I'm aware of what my record looks like." "What does it actually look like?" Mara considered her for a moment. Shaw was not asking casually. She had the look of someone who had pulled a thread and found it went somewhere she hadn't expected, and she was deciding how hard to keep pulling. "It looks like 8 years that belong to a different file than the one you're cleared to access." Shaw was quiet for a beat. The K-9 Specialized Operations Program. Mara didn't confirm, didn't deny. "It was disbanded," Shaw said. 11 years ago. I was a junior handler when I heard about it. We were told it was a resource consolidation. Later I heard other things." She studied Mara's face. "Behavioral conditioning frameworks that current training doctrine doesn't use. Advanced cross-species communication protocols. A command structure that wasn't built around control." "What was it built around?" "Partnership," Shaw said. "Or that's what I heard." She glanced at the scars on Mara's hand. "Where'd you get those?" "Training." "Looks like more than training." "It was more than training," Mara said. "It was also training." Shaw let that sit. "Then the dogs in this unit were sourced through Fort Callum's Advanced Acquisition Program. They were part of a second-generation cohort dogs bred from lines that went through KSOP's original conditioning phase before the program closed." She watched Mara's face carefully. "You know what that means?" "It means they were conditioned to respond to KSOP command architecture in their early socialization period, before any of your handlers worked with them." Mara looked past Shaw toward the corridor, where she could see the shepherd lying quiet, his breathing finally even. "It's not mystical. It's not a trick. It's behavioral science. Those dogs have a layered command structure, and the top layer, the one your handlers work with every day, sits on top of something older, something foundational. When they picked up my scent and my posture, the foundational layer activated, what your handlers were competing with." Shaw absorbed this. "And the word you used, AXOP release and hold command. Obsolete. Not in any current training manual, but it worked. It worked because those dogs are built to respond to it. It would have worked for anyone with the right conditioning and the right voice calibration." She paused. "There aren't many of us left." Shaw nodded slowly, processing. "Why didn't you say this at the beginning?" "Because at the beginning, Lieutenant Cole was telling me to leave, and I was trying to leave. I wasn't trying to get involved. You could have identified yourself. I'm a nurse at Callaway Regional. That's who I am. Everything else is its old history. I'm not in that world anymore." Shaw looked at her for a long moment. "You were good at it." It wasn't quite a question. Mara didn't answer it like one. "I was," she said simply. They walked back out into the corridor. Ethan was standing where they'd left him, with the rigid posture of a man who had been excluded from a conversation he believed he should have been part of, and was storing that resentment somewhere. It would cause him trouble later if he wasn't careful. The handlers had settled into quiet monitoring, and the dogs were in the easiest state they'd been since the corridor incident began. Shaw stopped in front of Ethan. "I need the unit's full transit documentation. Medical logs for all 7 animals going back 30 days. Ethan blinked. "Ma'am, I don't see why." "Because I'm asking for it, Lieutenant." "Sufficient." He pulled out his tablet with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided that doing the task is better than questioning the task, for now, and began navigating to the relevant files. While he did, Mara walked slowly along the formation, not close enough to interfere, just moving at a pace that let her see each dog clearly. She stopped at the female Malinois with the scar above her eye. The dog tracked her approach without moving. Calm, attentive, the scar giving her face an asymmetry that made her expression harder to read than the others. "This one's been separated recently," Mara said. Shaw looked up. "Her partner was injured in a training exercise 6 weeks ago. She's been solo since. She's been compensating harder than the rest. The travel stress is sitting differently on her because she doesn't have her anchor." Mara looked at the dog for a moment. "What's her name?" Mara didn't crouch down. She just stayed where she was and let Vera look at her. And after a moment, Vera's tail moved once, not a wag. Something more restrained, more deliberate. The specific movement of a working dog acknowledging something important. He's going to need more decompression time than the others before the next leg, Mara said. Noted, Shaw said. Ethan had found the documentation. He held the tablet out to Shaw with the energy of someone completing a required task under protest. Shaw took it and began reading, and Mara could tell from the small change in Shaw's posture, a slight forward shift, a tightening around the eyes that she was finding something. The medical logs for the shepherd, Shaw said. 3 entries in the last 2 weeks for gait irregularity, each one cleared as minor and not flagged for follow-up. His handler cleared them? Mara asked. Shaw looked at Ethan. Ethan's jaw tightened. The evaluating vet tech cleared them. I reviewed and approved. On what basis? On the basis that the dog's performance metrics were within acceptable range, and the vet tech found no structural damage in the field examination. Field examination, Mara said, not as a challenge. Just repeating it, the way you repeat something when the problem with it is obvious enough to not need elaboration. Ethan caught the tone. We have a schedule to maintain. Shepherd Boone passed his last full evaluation at Fort Callum before departure. When was that? A pause. 3 weeks ago. Mara looked at Boone. The shepherd was lying on his good side now. Right hip up? And she could see from here that the hip was carrying less muscle mass than it should have been. A subtle asymmetry that was easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. It was the kind of thing that happened slowly, over weeks, the body quietly redistributing load. He needs imaging, she said, before he flies again. That's not your call, Ethan said. No, she agreed. It's not. She looked at Shaw. Shaw looked at the tablet, then at Boone, then at Ethan, with the expression of a person who has just been given information she would have preferred to have earlier. The thing about Ethan Cole was that he wasn't incompetent. He wasn't careless the way careless people are careless, the kind who miss things because they're not looking. He was careless the way certain trained people get careless, which is different and arguably worse. He had a framework that worked most of the time, and inside that framework he was precise and reliable, and the framework had stopped him from seeing the things that didn't fit inside it. Mara had known people like him her entire career. Good people with calcified judgment who were fine until they weren't, and when they weren't, it was usually something or someone that paid for it. She didn't say any of this. She didn't need to. Shaw handed the tablet back to Ethan. I'm recommending Boone receive imaging before the final transport leg. I'll document it as a precautionary measure. Ethan's mouth opened and then closed. That delays our timeline by at minimum 4 hours. I'm aware. The receiving unit at Fort Devlin is expecting the full team, and they'll receive the full team when I'm satisfied that the full team is fit to travel, Lieutenant. Shaw said it without heat, which made it land harder than if she'd raised her voice. Document the delay and notify receiving command. I'll take responsibility for the change. Ethan took the tablet back. He was working very hard at being professional about it, and the effort was visible. Mara watched him type the notification and recognized the particular quality of his silence, the silence of a man who has been overruled by a woman he underestimated and has not yet processed what he's supposed to do with that. It was a silence she had encountered before, in different rooms, in different uniforms, wearing different faces. It always felt exactly like this. Decker had finished with Rook's water and was quietly going through the same check on the other dogs, animal by animal, the way Mara had mentioned, without quite telling him to. He was working quickly, without fanfare, clearly not wanting to draw attention to the fact that he was doing something that hadn't been on the official task list. The other handlers watched him, and then, one by one, started doing the same checks with their own animals. Small things. Small shifts. The kind that don't show up in incident reports but matter anyway. Shaw pulled Mara aside again, away from the main formation, and this time she didn't bother checking if Ethan followed. He didn't. I want to ask you something, Shaw said, and I want you to understand it's not for any official purpose. Mara waited. Case-op was closed because the program produced results. The command structure couldn't standardize, Shaw said. The handlers who came out of it were exceptional, but the methodology was too individualized, too dependent on the specific handler-animal bond. Command wanted replicable. They couldn't make Case-op replicable, so they ended it. She paused. I heard the people who ran it were told their work would be classified and archived, that they'd be released back into civilian life and their service records would reflect conventional assignments. The program would be treated as if it hadn't existed. It's accurate, Mara said. Were you given a choice? About leaving? Mara was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet the way someone goes quiet when they're deciding how much is the right amount to give. We were told the program was over. That was the choice. Stay in conventional service or transition out. Most people transitioned. She looked at the corridor floor briefly. The dogs didn't get a choice. They went into the standard canine pipeline with conditioning that no one in the pipeline knew about, which is what you're seeing now. Shaw took that in. There must be others. Other handlers who could respond to these dogs the way you did. Maybe. I don't know where they are. We didn't exactly stay in touch, she said it. Flatly, not bitterly, just as a fact. It's been 11 years. People build different lives. You built a pretty specific one. Trauma nurse. People come in broken and you figure out how to help them. It's not that different from what I did before. She paused. It's a lot more paperwork. Shaw looked at her for a moment, and something softened briefly in her face, not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. Then it went professional again. I'm going to need to document this incident. Your involvement, your intervention, the outcome. It's going to pull at some threads. I know. It may attract attention from people who classified those threads. I know that too. You don't seem worried I'm not, Marissa said. I haven't done anything wrong. I walked through the wrong door, and I helped your dogs. If someone has a problem with that, they can take a number. Shaw almost smiled. Not quite. There's someone in the observation room, she said. Has been since about 2 minutes after the dogs responded to you. I don't recognize the insignia. Mara didn't look toward the observation room. She'd clocked it already, the stillness behind the frosted glass, the particular quality of being watched by someone who was being careful not to be obvious about it. How long before you have a name? I put in a request 10 minutes ago. Let me know what you find. Shaw nodded. Then quieter, you intervened when you didn't have to. You could have walked out when Cole told you to. I tried to walk out. The shepherd pulled free. You could have kept walking. Mara looked at Vera, the solo Malinois, who was watching her from 15 feet away with steady dark eyes. No, she said, I couldn't. She walked back toward the formation, and Ethan tracked her movement the way he'd been tracking it since the beginning, wary, unsettled, with the particular unease of a man whose framework has developed a crack and who hasn't yet decided whether to acknowledge it or paper over it. He had his tablet out again, and he was writing something, which gave him something to look at that wasn't her. Boone had shifted position. The shepherd was up on his sternum now, a half-reclined posture, watching Mara as she approached with that particular attentiveness that said his orientation systems were fully engaged even when his body was resting. Stopped a few feet from him and crouched at the knees, not all the way down, not a submissive posture, just a reduction in her vertical profile, and Boone's ears came up. You're doing fine, she said, to him specifically. In the quiet particular way, you talk to an animal that you know is listening. You've been doing fine this whole time. Boone's tail moved twice. Slow, deliberate. A shepherd's version of acknowledgement. Behind her, she heard Ethan set his tablet down. She didn't turn around. How long did you work with dogs? His voice was different than it had been. Soft exactly. But the command edge had gone out of it. What was left was something more genuine, which made it harder to deflect. Long enough, she said. That's not an answer, I know. She stood back up. I'm not trying to be difficult. It's a complicated question. Try me. She looked at him. He was doing the thing people do when they've said something dismissive and they're just starting to feel the weight of it. The eyes a little too steady, the posture a little too careful. He hadn't apologized yet. He wasn't sure yet that he owed one. But he was in the early territory of figuring that out, which was its own kind of progress. 8 years, she said, give or take. Doing what? What you saw and more. She turned back to the formation. The answer to your next question is yes. It was military, and no. I can't give you the specifics. He was quiet for a moment. You knew what was wrong with Boone. Before you'd been in the corridor for 10 minutes. Yes. I had 3 vet tech clearances. Field clearances from people working under schedule pressure with animals who are trained not to show pain. She said it without inflection. They did what they could with what they had. It's not a failure, Lieutenant. It's a gap. He was still looking at her. She could feel it without turning. I told you to leave, he said, twice. You did. If you had, Boone would have pulled again, and someone would have gotten hurt trying to hold him. Maybe a handler, maybe a civilian in the corridor. She paused. Or maybe not. Maybe your team would have worked it out. I don't know. I made a call. The silence between them had a different texture now. Still uncomfortable, but differently. So, not the discomfort of conflict, but the discomfort of 2 people rearranging their understanding of a situation, and neither of them quite finished with the process. Decker appeared at Ethan's shoulder. Boone's water's done, sir. And Vera's eating. She hadn't touched the travel ration before, but she just finished it. Ethan looked at Decker, then at Mara, then at Vera, who was indeed sitting up with the clean-finished look of an animal that had just consumed something necessary. Good, he said. which was not the most articulate response, but it was genuine. Shaw came back into the corridor from the checkpoint area, and she was moving differently than before. Faster, with the specific quality of controlled urgency that commanders develop for situations that have just gotten more complicated. She walked directly to Mara, and her voice was very low. "I have the name of the person in the observation room." Mara waited. "Colonel Whitfield Draper, Office of Military Information and Records." Shaw's eyes were steady and completely serious. "He's not here for the K9 transport." Mara went very still. "He's been here since before the dogs arrived," Shaw continued. "According to the gate log, he came through the secured transit wing 4 hours ago with a priority clearance that my office doesn't have the access level to query." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. He'd been close enough to hear. Shaw looked at him, and then at Mara, and made a decision about how much to say. "It means Colonel Draper had prior knowledge of this transit detail, and he's been watching this corridor since before any of this started." She looked at Mara. "He may have been watching for you specifically." Mara looked at the frosted glass of the observation room. Stillness behind it hadn't changed. The figure was still there, and whoever it was had been still in exactly that way for the better part of an hour, which meant they were either very patient or they were waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. "Did he send anyone?" Mara asked. "Not yet." "Has he made contact with your command?" "Not through any channel I've been notified of." Mara looked at the glass for another moment. Then she looked at the 7 dogs lying quiet in the corridor, Boone with his bad hip, Vera with her missing partner, Rook finally hydrated, all of them in the strange peace that had come over them since she'd said the word. "He's going to come out," she said. "Probably," Shaw agreed. "When he does, let me talk to him first." Shaw looked at her. "Why?" Mara looked back at the observation room. "Because I know who he is," she said. "And he's not here because the dogs made noise." The frosted glass shifted. A shadow moved behind it, not the casual movement of someone repositioning themselves, but the deliberate movement of someone who had reached a decision. The door to the observation room had a handle that was visible from the corridor, and that handle was starting to turn. The handle turned all the way, and the door opened. Colonel Whitfield Draper was not what Ethan had expected. He was in his early 60s, lean in the way that comes from decades of irregular meals rather than deliberate fitness, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been weathered by something other than sun. He wore a service uniform that was correct in every detail, pressed, decorated, not a thread out of place, but he moved in it like a man who had stopped noticing what he was wearing a long time ago. His eyes went to Mara first. Not to Shaw, not to the dogs, not to the incident unfolding in the corridor. Directly to Mara, with the particular quality of attention that said he had been looking for her specifically and had found what he was looking for. Mara did not step back. She did not step forward. She stood where she was and let him cross the corridor toward her, and the distance between them closed in the silence of everyone else in the space, trying to understand what they were watching. "Mara," he said, "Colonel Draper, not warm, not hostile. The specific register of 2 people who know each other well and have not spoken in a long time, where the histories between them is complicated enough that no simple tone covers it." Ethan looked at Shaw. Shaw was watching Draper the way she watched things that required full attention completely, without obvious reaction. "You've been here since before the transport arrived," Mara said. "Yes. You knew I'd be on the connecting flight." Draper's expression shifted slightly, not guilt exactly, something more controlled than guilt, and older. "Flag on your travel profile. Passive notification. I was in the region, and I saw the flag, and I came." "A flag," she said. The word was flat. "The program closed 11 years ago, Colonel. You flagged my travel. It wasn't invasive monitoring. It was, I don't care what you call it." Her voice was still quiet. That was the thing about it. She didn't raise it. She had the kind of anger that goes colder instead of hotter, which was more uncomfortable to be near than shouting. "Put a flag on my life, and you waited for it to trip. And now you're here, because something happened, and you needed to see what I did with it. Why you didn't come out. You were watching." Draper was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I was watching." Shaw stepped forward. "Colonel, I'm Major Rebecca Shaw, K9 Transport Command. I need to understand your authority in this corridor, and your interest in this incident." Draper looked at her. "I'll provide that documentation, Major. First, I need 2 minutes with Ms. Bennett." "That's not." 2 minutes, Mara said to Shaw. "It's okay." Shaw looked at her with the expression of someone who was not convinced it was okay, but who had decided to defer, for now, because Mara's read on the situation had been accurate more often than not, since she'd walked through that door. "Step back." Ethan stepped back with her, though less willingly. Draper moved with Mara to the corridor's far wall, away from the dogs, away from the handlers, far enough that their voices would carry only to each other. There's a review, he said quietly. Direct. The man knew how to get to the point. Inspector General. It started 8 months ago, initiated by a congressional inquiry into classified program closures between 2005 and 2015. SOP is on the list. Mara looked at him. What kind of review? Kind that asks whether the people who ran classified programs made the decisions they were authorized to make, whether resources were appropriately allocated, whether personnel were treated in accordance with their service agreements. He paused. Whether the dogs were handled ethically. She was still for a moment. 11 years later, oversight moves slowly, but it moves. And what does this have to do with today? Today is what I'd call a complicating development, Draper said. You intervened in a classified military K-9 transport using knowledge and techniques from a program that officially doesn't exist. In a public transit facility, on camera, he let that land. The intervention was necessary, and by my read, you prevented a significant incident. But it's going to generate documentation. Shaw's incident report, Cole's incident report, airport security records, the transit logs. Your name is going to appear in paperwork that connects to a program that's currently under IG review. Came to warn me. He held her gaze. I came because I owe you that much. Mara looked at him for a long moment. The corridor hummed around them, the distant white noise of an airport, the quieter breathing of 7 dogs in rest, the low-register tension of everyone waiting. What happened to the others, she asked. Most of them are fine. Civilian lives. A few stayed in conventional service. He paused. Kovacs died in 2019. Climbing accident in Washington state. She absorbed that. Kovacs had been the best of them, better than her. She'd always thought, though he would have argued. She filed it away somewhere private and kept her face neutral, because they were in a corridor with people watching. The dogs, she said. The ones from the program. How many are still operational? Across all units, best estimate 40 to 60 animals. Second and third generation cohort. And none of the handlers in those units know what they're working with. The transition documentation was incomplete. You know that. I know it was incomplete because it was designed to be incomplete. She looked at him directly. You were there, Colonel. You signed off on the handover protocols. Draper didn't look away. He took that the way he was supposed to as a fact, not as an accusation, though the line between them was thin. Yes, he said, I did. Behind them there was a sound. Not dramatic, just a shift in the ambient noise of the corridor, one of those changes that trained attention picks up before the conscious mind catches up. Mara turned. Boone was up, not in a threat display. The shepherd was on his feet, and he was moving slowly, carefully, favoring the left side toward the stretch of corridor that led to the main terminal junction. His lead was still attached to his handler's belt clip, but the handler, a sergeant named Wills, had been distracted by the arrival of Draper, and the slack in the lead had played out incrementally. Boone was 12 feet from Wills and moving. Not fast, not erratic, but with that particular focus quality that working dogs display when they've identified something that their training says matters. Boone, Wills said sharply, reaching for the lead. Boone didn't stop. 2 things happened in rapid succession. Wills caught the lead, which snapped taut, and Boone's forward momentum combined with the resistance sent him off balance. His compromised hip gave way on the catch, not catastrophically but visibly. The shepherd, stumbling and going down to his knees on the corridor floor, with a grunt that was not a sound military working dogs make in the ordinary course of things. Mara was moving before Boone hit the floor. She covered the distance in 8 steps, not running. Running would have escalated every dog in the formation, but moving with the rapid, controlled pace of a trauma nurse who knows the difference between moving fast and moving right. She was at Boone's side by the time he'd righted himself to a sitting position, and she went to her knees on the corridor floor without hesitating, airport attire and all. Don't pull him up, she said to Wills, who had been about to do exactly that. Let him find his own position. Wills stopped. He looked scared, which was the right response. Boone was the senior dog in the unit, and his status in the formation meant that any significant distress from him would ripple outward. Mara put her hands on Boone's sides. Not restraining. Just contact the specific kind of contact that says I'm here. I have information. Stay with me. Boone was trembling faintly, not from pain but from the effort of keeping himself stable, and she could feel under her palms the specific tension pattern of an animal compensating for a joint that had given insufficient warning. Tell me what happened, she said to Wills. He just started moving. I had slack in the lead. Not your fault. He heard something. She was feeling along Boone's left hip now with her fingertips, the systematic palpation of someone who has done this before. Swelling here. Not new, this has been building for days. Where is his last full mobility assessment? The Fort Calamity Val 3 weeks ago. Told the lieutenant, I know. How long has he been hesitating on ramps? Wills blinked. About 2 weeks. I logged it as a behavioral note. I didn't know if it's not behavioral, Mara said. His iliofemoral ligament is inflamed, possibly early dysplastic deterioration. He needs imaging today, not before the next flight today, before he takes any more weight on that hip. She looked up at Wills. You logged it. That was the right call. Wills exhaled. The lieutenant said it wasn't a priority. Ethan heard that. He was standing 10 feet away and he heard it clearly, and Mara watched him receive it the particular way a person receives information that tells them their judgment costs something, and she looked back at Boone. Okay, she said to the shepherd quietly. Okay. Down. She pressed 2 fingers lightly at the point of his shoulder, the specific case-op contact signal for a lateral rest, and Boone lay down on his good side without resistance. Good, stay there. Shaw was on her radio. Mara didn't need to hear the words to know she was calling for veterinary support. Draper stood at the edge of the scene and watched Mara work, and his face had the expression of someone watching something they had made a decision about 11 years ago, and were only now fully understanding the cost of that decision. The other dogs had gone still, not the commanded stillness of the downstay, but something more instinctive, the way a group of animals goes quiet when the senior member of the group is in distress. Vera, the solo Malinois, had her chin on the floor and her eyes fixed on Boone with the steady, grieving attention of an animal whose orientation system was already compromised. Stable, Mara said, to the handlers, to anyone who needed to hear it. He's not in acute crisis. He needs support and rest and imaging, not emergency intervention. Keep the other dogs calm, their state affects him. Decker was already doing it, working quietly along the formation, one hand at a time, the same calm check-in he'd been doing since he'd watched Mara work the first time. The other handlers followed his lead without being told, which was its own kind of quiet competence. Ethan crouched down near Boone. He didn't try to touch the dog. He looked at Mara briefly, a quick check, and she gave him a small nod that said it was okay to be close. He looked at Boone, and his jaw was tight in a different way than it had been before. Not the tight jaw of someone asserting authority. The tight jaw of someone swallowing something that had gone down wrong. How long, he asked quietly. How long has it been building? How long before he can fly? She studied the hip. Depends on what imaging shows. Best case, 5 to 7 days with proper anti-inflammatory protocol and restricted movement. Worst case, we're looking at surgical evaluation. She paused. He's young. He's in otherwise good condition. If you'd caught it 2 weeks ago when your handler logged the ramp hesitation, it would have been a shorter answer. Ethan looked at Boone. The shepherd's breathing had settled, his eyes half closed in the particular restful state of an animal that had stopped fighting against something it had been fighting against for a while. There was something almost relieved in his posture, which was its own kind of accusation. Ethan said nothing. Mara stood up. Her knees had the corridor floor's texture pressed into them, and her hands were slightly dusty from the airport floor, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had gone to the ground without thinking about it, because it was where the work was. Draper was watching her from 7 feet away. He had the look of a man who had come to this corridor with a plan, and was watching the plan become irrelevant, which was not entirely a bad look for him. Some people are more honest when their prepared version of events runs out. Shaw finished her radio call and came back. Veterinary support en route. TA 12 minutes. She looked at Mara. There's something else. Mara looked at her, the IG review that Colonel Draper mentioned. Shaw said it flatly, to Draper as much as to Mara. I have a colleague at the Pentagon liaison office. I made a call while you were with Boone. She paused. Case-op review has been active for 8 months. Last month it escalated to a formal investigation status. They're looking at behavioral conditioning protocols, handler welfare, and the disposition of animals from the program. Her eyes moved between Draper and Mara. They're looking for testimony from former case-op personnel. I'm aware of the review, Draper said. Are you aware that it was elevated? Shaw asked. Because my colleague says the elevation happened 11 days ago, and the notification to affected parties was supposed to go out through official channels within 72 hours. That would have been 8 days ago. Draper was quiet. Did the notification go out? Shaw asked. There were delays in the notification process. To whom, specifically, was the notification delayed? Draper looked at Mara. She looked back at him. Something settled in her face, not surprise, not quite, but the particular expression of a person who had wondered about something for a long time and just received confirmation. You flagged my travel profile, she said, but you didn't send the IG notification. Mara, you knew I was supposed to be notified 8 days ago, and you didn't send it. Process is complicated. The process is supposed to protect personnel. The whole point of the notification window, it gives former program members time to engage legal counsel before IG contact. She looked at him steadily. You withheld my notification. The corridor was very quiet. The dogs, the handlers, Ethan, Decker, everyone was still doing the specific kind of not listening that people do when they are listening to everything. I want to understand your reasoning, Mara said, before I decide what to do with this. Draper was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, he did it like a man who has run out of the version of himself that explains things away. I thought if I made contact first, I could manage it. Give you context before the IG got to you. Make sure you understood the parameters. Make sure I understood the parameters, she repeated. You mean make sure I understood what you wanted me to say? It's not. That's what it sounds like, Colonel. There was no heat in it. That was somehow worse. You've been managing this program's legacy for 11 years. You managed the closure. You managed the handover documentation. You managed the narrative. And now there's an independent review, and you're still trying to manage it. She paused. Came to this corridor because you saw my travel flag, and you needed to know if I was still manageable. Draper's face did something complicated. I came because I owe you. You owe me a notification that arrived on time. Shaw stepped in. Not aggressively, she had the measured pace of someone who had decided the situation needed an institutional presence. Colonel Draper, I'm going to need to document your presence here and your relationship to the personnel involved in this incident. That documentation will be available to the IG review as part of the standard incident file. Draper looked at her, then at Mara. He made the calculation that was available to him, which was the calculation of a man who had run out of moves that didn't cost him something. Understood, he said. At that moment, Mara's attention shifted. Not because anything obvious had changed, but because Vera had made a sound. The solo Malinois was up on her feet, not in threat display, not in the frantic energy of before, but in the specific alert posture of a working dog that has picked up an active signal. Her nose was working fast, her head angled toward the terminal junction corridor, and she was trembling in a way that was distinct from stress, trembling the full-body vibration of an animal in high arousal, pressed because she'd been trained to suppress it, but present. Mara looked down the junction corridor. There was a man, not in uniform. He'd been in the corridor before she'd clocked him as a civilian with a delayed connection, standing near the gate junction with a rolling bag, reading something on his phone. He'd been there long enough that he'd become background. But Vera was not treating him as background. Mara looked at Vera, then back at the man. Vera's head was perfectly still now, nose up. The trembling had stopped, which was worse than the trembling, because working dogs trained in detection still when they've confirmed rather than suspected. Shaw, Mara said. Her voice was quiet. Shaw heard the quality in it and was at her shoulder in 3 steps. What? Vera's alerting. Shaw went still to the man by the junction. Patrol dog, not detection. She's a second-generation Kasap cohort animal. Her socialization conditioning included cross-discipline familiarization. She may have broader alerting capability than her current training classification reflects. Mara watched Vera. The Malinois had not moved, had not made another sound, was holding the alert with the motionless precision of an animal that had been trained to hold it until released or confirmed. She's been holding that for 40 seconds. That's not a false positive. Shaw already had her radio. I need security personnel at the terminal junction on the restricted transit wing. Possible detection alert, K9 unit, non-uniformed individual, male standing near gate junction. Do not approach loudly. Plainclothes security to confirm. Fonts came back fast. Shaw listened, and Mara watched her face. And Shaw's face did the thing faces do when information arrives that is much worse than the available alternative. Airport security had a report, Shaw said. Flag bag near the international terminal. 20 minutes ago. They thought it was a misread. She looked at Mara. They cleared it. Who cleared it? Single scan. Standard protocol. Shaw's jaw was tight. Vera wasn't part of that sweep. She is now, Mara said. The man by the junction was still on his phone, still looking at the screen. And Vera was still holding her alert motionless, nose up. Every muscle in her compact body held in the perfect, terrible stillness of confirmed detection, and the corridor that had been complicated for the last 90 minutes had just become something else entirely. Shaw spoke into her radio again, her voice dropping to the operational register. That means the situation has moved from procedural to urgent. Draper had straightened up with the instinct of decades, the civilian complexity falling away, the uniform suddenly meaning what it was made to mean. Ethan was already moving his handlers into loose cover positions, not obviously. Not in a way that would change the ambient noise of the terminal, but moving. And Mara was watching Vera. The Malinois had held the alert for 90 seconds without a command to hold it, without her partner, without the confirmation of a handler who trusted her read. without anyone in the corridor who officially knew what she was trained to do. She had held it on the pure foundation of what she was built for, in a program that had been erased from the official record 11 years ago, protected by a woman who had walked through the wrong door on the way to a connecting flight she was never going to catch. The man by the junction shifted his weight. Vera's ear rotated 1 degree toward the movement. Mara said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Don't let airport security run the approach." Shaw, already on the radio, heard her, looked at her. "If she's right about the bag," Mara said, "the approach protocol matters more than the response protocol. They run in loud, I know," Shaw said. She said something into the radio, sharp and specific, the kind of instruction that doesn't have civilian translations. Draper was looking very still. He was looking at Vera, and then at Mara, and his face had the expression of a man watching something be true that he had decided 11 years ago was no longer necessary. Ethan came up beside Mara. Not confrontational, just present. He stood where he stood and looked at Vera, and looked at the man by the junction, and looked at Mara. "Tell me what you need," he said. He said it simply. It was obvious. Like the last 90 minutes had compressed into that sentence and everything, before it had been a different conversation entirely. Mara looked at him. Then at Vera, who was still holding, still motionless, still certain. "Give me Vera's lead," she said. The handler holding Vera's lead, a corporal named Tasha Reyes, who had been watching Vera with the focused attention of someone who had worked with this dog long enough to know when to trust her, looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Mara, and then something shifted in his face. Something final. He nodded at Reyes. Reyes unclipped the lead and held it out to Mara, and Mara took it. And the moment the lead transferred, Vera turned her head and looked up at Mara with the full, unambiguous certainty of an animal that had been waiting for exactly this. And then the Malinois turned back toward the junction corridor, lead going taut with steady, controlled purpose. The man by the junction put his phone in his pocket, started walking. Vera moved and Mara moved with her. Not fast, that was the thing that would stay with Ethan afterward, the thing he'd write about in his incident report and then revise 3 times, because he couldn't make it sound like what it was without sounding like he'd lost his mind. They didn't run. Mara walked at exactly the pace that kept the lead at a consistent angle, and Vera walked at exactly the pace that kept Mara from having to correct, and together they moved down the junction corridor with the fluid, unhurried precision of 2 entities that had been working together for years instead of 45 seconds. The man with the rolling bag had covered 30 feet toward the main terminal. Shaw had 2 plainclothes security personnel in the junction corridor, within 90 seconds of her radio call airport security contractors, who materialized out of the terminal foot traffic with the practiced casualness of people trained to look like they were doing nothing. They did not converge. They paralleled, was right, and they kept their eyes forward, which was also right, and they were good at their jobs, but they were watching Vera the way you watch something you don't have a category for. Mara didn't look at them. She looked at Vera, and Vera looked at the man. The man's name, as it turned out, was not something anyone in the corridor would know for another 22 minutes. What they could see was that he was in his mid-30s, medium build, a gray jacket that was slightly too warm for the terminal, and a rolling carry-on that he was handling with the specific casualness of someone who had rehearsed being casual with it. Phone was in his pocket. He was walking toward the international departure level. Vera did not slow down. Mara let the lead play to its full extension, not pulling Vera back, not rushing her forward, just keeping contact and letting the dog work at the distance her nose required. 20 feet, 15. The man was moving toward the escalator bank. Then Vera sat. Clean, square, perfect. The trained final alert of a detection dog who has confirmed what she suspected. She sat and she looked up at Mara, and her body language said, with the absolute clarity of an animal that does not possess itself, "Here, right here." Mara stopped walking. She looked at the man's bag, then at the 2 plainclothes officers who were reading Vera correctly and were already adjusting their angles. She kept her voice flat and low, below the ambient terminal noise, speaking to the officer on her left without looking at him directly. Left side of the bag. External pocket. Don't let him know you're moving until you're positioned. The officer looked at her, a quick, involuntary reassessment, and then at his partner, and then they moved, and they did it well. The man with the bag made it 4 more steps before the geometry of the situation closed around him, in a way that left him nowhere obvious to go. And by that point, the second officer had come up on his right side and said something that Mara didn't catch, but that had the tone of someone presenting an unavoidable fact. The man stopped. He looked at Vera. Vera looked back at him with the calm, implacable attention of an animal that has finished its job and is waiting for the humans to catch up. What followed was procedural and unpleasant, in the specific way that airport security situations are unpleasant, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the grinding institutional machinery of people doing necessary work under fluorescent lights, while other travelers detoured around them, with the eyes-forward urgency of people who had flights to catch. The man was cooperative, which meant something or nothing, depending on why he was cooperative, and the bag was flagged, and the secondary sweep team arrived within 4 minutes, and Mara stood back with Vera's lead in her hand and let the process be the process. Shaw appeared at her shoulder. Good call on the approach protocol. The first security team would have gone in loud, would have spooked him into moving the bag. Instead, he walked right to them. Shaw looked at Vera, who was still sitting, still watching the man, with the specific focused patience of an animal that had nothing left to prove. What was in the bag? I don't know yet, Mara said. Your read? Vera's read. She looked at the Malinois. Ask her. She's the one who found it. The secondary sweep confirmed it 11 minutes later, not an explosive device, which was the worst case, but a package of materials that had no business being in a secured transit wing, specifics of which would work their way through federal documentation for weeks before anyone outside the immediate response chain understood the full picture. What mattered in the short term was that the flag was real, Vera's alert was real, and the man in the gray jacket was now in the custody of federal security personnel who had arrived with a speed that suggested they had already been looking for him. Mara stood in the junction corridor with Vera's lead in her hand and watched the machinery work, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day specifically. Was the older tiredness, the one that came from being good at something you had tried to put down. Ethan was beside her. She hadn't heard him come up. He wasn't announcing himself, he was just there, standing where he stood, with the particular quality of presence that people develop when they've spent enough time in situations where being present was the only thing on offer. He had his hands at his sides, and he was watching the secondary team work, and he wasn't saying anything. And for once his silence didn't feel like suppressed authority. Just felt like a person standing next to another person. Boone's on his way to the veterinary facility, he said finally. Airport has a partner clinic 20 minutes out. Shaw arranged it. Good. They're going to do the imaging today. The other dogs are getting a full rest period before any decision about the transport timeline. He paused. Called Fort Devlin. Told them the delay was my call. Mara looked at him. It was my call, he said, signing off on those vet tech clearances. I looked at the paperwork, and I looked at the schedule, and I made the easier decision. He said it without drama. Not self-flagellation, just a man stating a fact he had taken inventory of. Was wrong. Yes, she said. He nodded slightly. He'd expected her to say something softer, maybe, or to say nothing, and she'd said exactly what it was. And the lack of cushion seemed to land better than cushion would have. Could have gone harder on that, in front of the handlers. You'll go harder on yourself than I would, she said. Sufficient. He was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Corridor. For telling you to leave, for the civilian interference log entry. Can amend the log, I already did. She looked at him. His face had the look of someone who had not slept well in a while, and was probably not going to sleep well tonight either, which was a human face, which was better than what he'd been wearing when she'd first seen him. You managed it, she said. When it went past your framework, you managed it. You let Shaw lead, and you put Reyes in a position to make the right call on the lead. That counts. He didn't look entirely comforted by this, which meant he'd probably understood it correctly. Shaw was coming back across the junction corridor, with Colonel Draper 2 steps behind her, and the expression of someone who had made several phone calls in the last 12 minutes and intended to make several more. Stopped in front of Mara and Ethan and took a breath that was the breath of someone organizing a significant amount of information. Federal security has confirmed the bag contents as restricted chemical precursors, she said. Not weaponized. But the materials are on the controlled transport list, and this individual is not a licensed carrier. They're running him now. She looked at Mara. Vera's alert is going into the federal incident file, with her registration number and unit designation. And her training classification? Mara asked. That's where it gets complicated, Shaw said, because officially Vera's classification is patrol, not detection. Her detection capability comes from conditioning she received before she entered the standard pipeline. Conditioning that doesn't exist in any current document. She paused. Her alert may be challenged in the federal file on the basis that she's not a certified detection animal. Mara looked at Vera, who was sitting at her feet with her chin slightly elevated, doing nothing, which was exactly the right thing to be doing. Detected it, I know, but the legal standard for canine evidence. Shaw, Mara said it quietly. The man had restricted chemical precursors in a secured transit facility. Vera found them. Whatever paperwork problem exists around Vera's classification is a paperwork problem. Detection happened. I agree with you, Shaw said. I'm telling you, there's going to be a fight about it. Then we document the detection accurately and we let the people whose job it is to fight paperwork fights do their jobs. She looked at Draper. Which brings us to what you're going to do about the IG notification. The junction corridor had thinned out. The secondary team was finishing. The plainclothes officers were wrapped around the custody situation. And what remained in the immediate space was a small cluster of people who had been through something together and were now standing at the edge of what came next. Draper looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recently tripped. Not fallen, he was still upright, still composed, still every inch the colonel he had been for 30 years. But he had tripped, and everyone in the corridor had seen it, and he was old enough and experienced enough to know that some things can't be walked back to before the trip. I'll send the notification today, he said. To all affected personnel, Mara said. Not a selective list. To all affected personnel. And the documentation from today, the incident file, the IG review materials, whatever Shaw's reports generate that goes to the IG's office complete and unredacted. Draper was quiet for a moment. There are classification concerns. Then the IG can navigate the classification concerns with full information instead of whatever version you'd have given them. She looked at him steadily. Spent 11 years managing the story of what KSOP was. Today a dog that came out of that program detected something your standard protocols missed. That's the story now, the IG should have it. Draper held her gaze. He was reading her, doing the calculation that experienced officers do when they're figuring out whether they're dealing with a threat or an inevitability, and after a moment something shifted in his face that said he'd landed on inevitability. You're not wrong, he said, which was the closest thing to concession she was going to get, and she knew it, and she took it for exactly what it was. Shaw had her tablet out and was documenting. Ethan was standing slightly apart from Draper, which was its own kind of statement. Decker had come up from the restricted corridor to check on Vera and was standing at the edge of the group, with the expression of someone who has heard more than he expected to hear and is still processing. Vera leaned against Mara's leg, not dramatically, just a small shift of weight, the way dogs do when they're tired, and they've found the thing they were looking for, and they're done working for the moment. Mara felt it and looked down, and Vera looked up at her with the calm, familiar eyes of an animal that had been waiting for someone who knew what to do with her, and Mara put her hand on the Malinois's head for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to matter, short enough to keep it professional, and then straightened up. She needs to be with the unit, Mara said to Reyes, who had come up behind Decker. Keep her near Boone's space tonight. She'll do better with his scent around than separated. Reyes took the lead. Yes, ma'am. The ma'am landed without ceremony. Reyes hadn't decided to say it, it had just come out. The way certain forms of address come out of people who have watched someone do something that reorganizes their understanding of who's who in a situation. Ethan heard it. Decker heard it. Nobody acknowledged it, which was the right call. The next 3 hours happened in the incremental, exhausting way that aftermath always happens: forms, statements, phone calls, the grinding bureaucratic machinery of an airport security incident, layered on top of a military canine transport disruption, layered on top of a federal custody situation. Mara gave her statement twice, once to airport security and once to a federal agent who arrived with the practiced speed of someone who had been monitoring the situation from before the custody moment. She answered every question directly, without elaboration, and corrected 2 factual errors in the preliminary incident summary with the specific, quiet authority of a woman who has filled out enough documentation in her career to know when something has been written wrong. The federal agent, a compact woman in her 40s named Special Agent Dory Fain, who had the energy of someone running on coffee and controlled frustration, asked her 3 times, in 3 different ways, how she knew the detection would hold. I didn't know, Mara said each time. Vera knew. I trusted her read. Fain wrote that down each time, which meant she was getting it, or she was building a file, or both. Draper gave his own statement in a separate room, and Mara didn't hear it, but she heard its shape in the way Shaw's posture changed after she came back from observing. Something had been said that moved things. Not enough to close the distance all at once, but enough to make it smaller. Shaw found her in the corridor near the K9 rest area that had been set up in a secured gate, hold a room with airline blankets on the floor and water stations, and the low ambient noise of 7 dogs, doing what dogs do when the pressure is finally off. Boone was back from the imaging facility with a wrap on his hip and a veterinary report that said early-stage dysplastic inflammation, restricted movement for 10 days, recheck before any transport consideration. He was lying in the center of the room, with the dignified agacen of a senior animal who has had an extremely long day and is not apologizing for taking up space. Vera was beside him. She'd laid herself against his good side with the specific proprietary certainty of an animal who has decided where she's going to be, and Boone had leaned into her slightly, and the room smelled like working dog and airline blanket, and the particular quiet of a situation that has resolved more than it was supposed to. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at them. IG's office called, Shaw said behind her. Draper notified them of the delayed personnel notifications. He listed himself as responsible for the delay. She paused. He didn't have to say it that way. He could have framed it as a process error. He said it that way. He said it that way. Mara looked at Boone and Vera. He's been carrying that program for 11 years. The right way and the wrong way at the same time. That gets heavy. She said it without forgiveness, without condemnation, just as an observation about what that kind of weight does to people over time. The IG wants a statement from you, Shaw said formally, about your time in KSOP, about today, about the dogs in the current pipeline who have KSOP conditioning that their handlers don't know about. I'll give it. It'll pull at things. Career things. History things. I'm a nurse, Shaw. I don't have career things left to protect in that world. She turned from the doorway. I'll give an accurate statement about what I did, what the program was, and what these dogs are capable of. That's all I have. Shaw studied her for a moment. You're not angry. I'm tired, Mara said. Angry and tired are different. I know how to be angry later. That's either very healthy or very concerning. Ask me in a week. Shaw almost smiled, the same almost smile from before. Suited her face. There's something else. Fain the federal agent, she ran the man with the bag. Connected to a supply chain that's been active for about 14 months, moving restricted materials through civilian transit routes. They'd been watching the chain, but hadn't been able to identify the transit mechanism. She looked at Mara carefully. Vera didn't just flag a random violation. She may have just cracked a 14-month federal case. Mara absorbed this. If the detection holds, Shaw continued, The federal file on the supply chain uses today's incident as the precipitating event. Vera's alert is the legal foundation of the custody, which means Vera's classification problem matters significantly more than a paperwork fight. Yes. Mara looked at the ceiling of the transit wing for a moment. Not for inspiration, just to look at something neutral while she thought. What does Vera need to be certified? Retroactive certification would require documentation of her conditioning history, a formal evaluation by a certified detection assessor, and approval from the K-9 training registry. Shaw paused. Conditioning history documentation doesn't exist in any accessible file. Part of KSOP's classified operational records. Who holds those records? Officially? The Office of Military Information and Records. Shaw let that sit. Draper's office. Mara looked at her. Has anyone formally requested them? The IG's office has the standing authority to request classified records relevant to their investigation. They request the KSOP operational files, and those files contain Vera's original conditioning documentation. Then she has a paper trail. Mara straightened. Have you told Fane? I was going to tell you first. Mara looked at the room where Vera was lying against Boone's side, in the quiet of an animal that had done what she was built to do and was resting in the aftermath. Then she looked at Shaw. Tell Fane. Shaw nodded and reached for her phone. Ethan found Mara 20 minutes later in the corridor outside the K-9 room. He had 2 cups of vending machine coffee, the bad kind, which was the only kind available in a transit wing, and he offered her one with the expression of someone who knows the coffee is bad, but has decided the gesture matters more than the quality. Took it. They stood without talking for a moment. Corridor was quieter now. The incident energy had moved downstream into paperwork, into federal channels, into the 6 different conversations happening on 6 different phones somewhere in the building. What was left here was just the corridor and the coffee, and the particular exhaustion of the end of something. I looked up KSOP, Ethan said. There's nothing to look up. I know, there's nothing, which is its own kind of information. He held his cup in both hands. 8 years. And then you became a trauma nurse. People change careers, that's not what I mean. He looked at the corridor floor briefly. I mean, you went from that, whatever that was, to being the person who catches the things other people miss. In a hospital, quietly. He looked at her. That's not a coincidence. No, she agreed. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I logged the corridor incident accurately. Every part of it, including my initial orders, including the civilian interference notation, and including the amendment removing that notation. He looked at her. I also logged that your intervention was the proximate cause of the positive outcome. That language is in the file. She looked at him. You didn't have to do that. I know. He drank the bad coffee. I did it anyway. It wasn't a redemption. He'd done what he'd done, and he'd also done this. And both things were true, and neither one canceled the other out. That was how it worked. She had been in enough situations to know that the people who screwed up and then cleaned it up were not the same as the people who'd gotten it right the first time, but they were often more useful than both categories combined because they'd been through the specific education of understanding where their framework broke down. She drank the coffee. It was in fact terrible. Booton's prognosis is good, she said. 10 days restriction, then a proper mobility evaluation before any transport. If you push for the full evaluation instead of another field clearance, he'll likely clear. Push for it. Good. And Vera's certification, Shaw told me what you're trying to do. With the IG request and the case files, he paused. Is it going to work? I don't know, she said honestly. Draper's office holds the files. Whether he cooperates with the IG request depends on whether today changed in something and how he's calculating this. Think it did? She thought about Draper's face when he'd said I didn't have to say it that way. About the specific quality of a man who has made a decision he can't unmake and is trying to figure out what to do with the person he is now. Think he came to this corridor to manage something and found out he couldn't. That's a particular kind of education. She looked at her coffee cup. People who've been managing things for a long time sometimes do better once they stop managing. I don't know if he's one of them. I'll find out when the IG gets the files or doesn't. Down the corridor, the K9 room door opened and Decker came out looking tired and more settled than he had since the beginning of the corridor incident. He nodded at Ethan, clocked Mara, with the specific acknowledgement of someone who has upgraded their understanding of who they're dealing with, and headed toward the handler's rest area without stopping. Ethan watched him go. He learned more today than he'd have learned in 3 months of standard rotation. He was already learning, Mara said. He just needed the situation to get complicated enough that his good instincts had room to work. Is that a comment about Decker or about me? It's a comment about Decker. He exhaled. That's fair. They stood in the corridor a little longer, and the airport continued its distant business around them. And Mara thought about Portland and the connecting flight she hadn't made, and the reason she'd been going in the first place, a scheduled 3-day trip to see a friend from her Callaway years who had moved to the Pacific Northwest and sent increasingly emphatic messages about Mara's chronic failure to visit. She would need to rebook. Her friend would give her a hard time about it. Mara would tell her some version of the truth that left out every classified detail, which would be a very short story, and her friend would not believe that was the whole story, and she would be correct. That was a later problem. Her phone, which had been in her carry-on bag since the corridor incident began, buzzed 3 times in quick succession. Pulled it out. 2 missed calls from Callaway Regional, which meant her shift tomorrow was already becoming a logistical problem, and 1 text from a number she didn't have saved, which shouldn't have been able to get to her personal phone, but which had, through some mechanism she was going to want to understand. Text said, "We need to talk about what's in the files. Not all of it is what you think it is." She stared at it. Kovacs died in 2019. That was what Draper had said. Climbing accident in Washington State. She read the text again. Corridor was quiet. Ethan had finished his coffee and was saying something, and she heard it as ambient sound because her attention was entirely on the phone screen, on the 11-character text from a number she didn't know, and on the single letter at the end of it that should not have been possible. "Bennett," Ethan said. She looked up. "You okay?" She locked her phone screen. "I need to make a call," she said. She walked to the far end of the corridor before she called the number back. It rang twice, 3 times. She was already constructing the alternative explanations, a wrong number, a coincidence of initials, someone who had gotten her contact through a mutual channel and used a shorthand that meant nothing when the line connected. And there was breathing on the other end, and then a voice she had not heard in 11 years said her name in exactly the way it had always said her name, which was with the faint upward inflection at the end that meant he already knew she'd been doing the math. Mara. She stood with her back against the corridor wall and her phone pressed against her ear, and she said nothing for a full 4 seconds. "You're not dead," she said. "No," a pause. "Draper told you I was." Climbing accident. Washington State, 2019. "Draper told me you'd gone completely private. No contact, no profile, nothing." Another pause. "Turns out we were both managed." The word landed with the specific weight of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being named. She thought about Draper's face in the corridor, calculation, the careful framing, the man who had been managing the story of KSOP for 11 years and had told 2 of its best people that the other one was gone. Not out of cruelty, probably. Out of the particular arrogance of someone who had decided that the cleanest way to close a chapter was to make sure nobody went back to read it. "Where are you?" she asked. "Portland," he said. "I've been in Portland for 3 years." She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter than a laugh and longer than an exhale. She had been on her way to Portland. Connecting flight she had missed. The trip she had been making to see a friend. The wrong door she had walked through because a gate attendant had waved her into a restricted corridor. All of it, entire sprawling mess of the day, had been carrying her toward a city where Alexander Kovacs had been living quietly for 3 years. The universe was not tidy. She did not believe in tidy. But sometimes the untidy things lined up in ways that were hard to explain without sounding like you'd lost your grip on cause and effect. Text, she said. What's in the files that I don't know? Case-op closure wasn't a resource decision, Kovacs said. Program was producing results that some people found inconvenient. Specifically, the results around what the dogs could detect beyond their primary training designation. Cross-discipline capability. Someone decided that capability was a liability, and the program was closed before the capability could be formally documented. He paused. The operational files that Draper's office holds, they contain the full conditioning records, not just the training logs, the detection work, everything. Draper's been sitting on files that would have certified every second-generation dog in the pipeline years ago. Mara was very still. He knew. He's known since the program closed. He helped design the non-disclosure structure. The files were classified at a level that would require either a direct IG request or a senior command authorization to access. Another pause. He could have authorized access at any point in the last 11 years. He didn't, because if the detection capability became documented, she said slowly, someone would start asking why it wasn't documented earlier. And the answer to that question leads back to why the program was really closed. Which leads back to who made that call, Kovacs said. And that person is currently a retired 3-star who sits on 2 defense advisory boards and has a very comfortable post-service arrangement. Thought about Vera. About the alert that had identified a 14-month federal supply chain case. About the 40 to 62nd generation dogs in the active military pipeline whose full capabilities were buried in a classified file in an office that had the power to release them and had chosen, repeatedly, not to. The IG request, she said, if it goes through, the files come out, everything. The detection records, the program closure rationale, the decision trail, all of it. His voice was steady. I've already given the IG's office a preliminary statement. I've been in contact with them for 6 weeks. That's how I knew to watch your travel. I asked someone to flag it when I heard the corridor incident had started moving through federal channels. Weeks, she said. You've been doing this for 6 weeks. And you didn't. I didn't know if you'd want to be involved. You went private. You built something clean. He paused, and the pause had the specific texture of someone saying something they've been sitting with for a long time. I didn't want to pull you back into it if you'd decided to be done. Stood in the corridor and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The fluorescent lights of Harwick International Airport buzzed faintly at a frequency that was not quite audible, but was definitely felt. The way certain truths are felt before they are understood. I walked through a wrong door, she said. I know. I wasn't trying to be involved. I know that too. And now I'm in the middle of a federal incident file, an IG review, and a canine certification dispute that has implications for every second-generation K-SOP dog in the active pipeline. Yes, he said, because a gate attendant waved me through a maintenance door. Mara, his voice was quiet. You stopped when Boone pulled. You could have kept walking. She thought about what Shaw had said. Same thing, almost exactly. She thought about Vera's unblinking alert, the perfect stillness of an animal doing the thing she was made to do in a system that had decided not to see it. She thought about Ethan's face when he understood what he'd missed, and Decker quietly watering the dogs, and Boone resting on his good side in a room with airline blankets on the floor. Send me everything you've given the IG, she said. I'll give my own statement tomorrow. Full account. Are you sure? I'm a trauma nurse, she said. I'm used to showing up after the damage is done and figuring out what's salvageable. This is salvageable. She pushed off the wall. Don't tell me you're dead again. I'll do my best, he said, which was the most Kovacs answer possible. She ended the call and stood for a moment in the empty stretch of corridor, holding her phone, looking at nothing specific, doing the thing that comes after a significant piece of information has arrived and before you've decided what to do with the person you are, now that you have it. Then she went to find Shaw. Shaw was at the checkpoint on her third phone call of the hour, and she had the looks of someone who has been managing multiple institutional conversations simultaneously and is running on competence and not much else. She held up one finger when she saw Mara, finished the call in 90 seconds, with the efficient precision of a woman who has learned to close conversations before they expand, and then looked at Mara with the specific attention of someone who notices when a person's face has changed. What happened? I need to tell you something about the case-op files, Mara said, and about who else has been talking to the IG. She told Shaw in 10 minutes, which was the right amount of time enough to give the relevant facts, not enough to editorialize. Shaw listened with the total stillness of a person building a structural picture, and when Mara finished she was quiet for 4 seconds, which was Shaw's version of a significant reaction. Draper's been holding the detection records, Shaw said, for 11 years. Yes. Shaw looked down the corridor toward the K9 restroom where Vera was sleeping against Boone's side, where 7 dogs were resting in the quiet aftermath of a day that had asked more of them than it was supposed to. He needs to know that we know, she said, before he talks to the IG again. Yes, and he needs to know that Kovacs has been talking to them for 6 weeks. She looked at Mara. That changes his calculation. He came here thinking he could manage you. He couldn't factor in Kovacs because he thought Kovacs was dead. If he knows Kovacs has already given a preliminary statement, he loses the ability to control the shape of what the IG finds, Mara said. Whatever version of the story he's been preparing to offer them, it has to square with whatever Kovacs has already said. Shaw picked up her phone. I'm calling the IG's office directly. I want to be on record as a witness to today's events before Draper has another conversation with them tonight. Good call, and Mara, Shaw stopped. Looked at her with an expression that was several things at once professional, measuring, and underneath both of those, something that was simply human. What you did today, all of it. The corridor Boone, Vera's alert, the approach protocol, none of that was in any file. None of that was documented anywhere. You did it because you were there and it needed doing. I walked through the wrong door, Mara said. You walked through the right door, Shaw said. The right time. For the right reasons. She paused. I know you don't want that framed as something significant, but it was. Mara looked at her. Make your call, Shaw. Shaw made her call. The rest of the evening moved in the way that evenings move after something has shifted, not resolved yet. Not clean, but differently weighted. Draper was still in the building, in a conference room with 2 of Fane's federal agents, and a phone line to the IG's office in Washington, and the conversation had been going for 40 minutes by the time Mara heard about it secondhand through Ethan, who had heard it from a transport coordinator who had been in the adjacent room. The details were sparse, but the shape was clear. Draper had stopped framing and started answering, which was a different posture from the one he'd arrived with. And the IG's office had received Shaw's witness account and Kovacs's existing statement and was now asking questions that could not be answered with management. At 9:14 p.m., Draper formally authorized the release of the case-op operational files to the IG's office. He did it in writing, with his signature, logged through the Office of Military Information and Records official request portal. Shaw showed Mara the confirmation. It was a document with a lot of bureaucratic language and a number in the top right corner, and Draper's signature at the bottom, And it was one of those documents that looks completely ordinary and means something enormous, and Mara looked at it for a long time before she handed the tablet back. "The files include Vera's conditioning records?" she asked. "They include complete conditioning records for all animals that went through KSOP's socialization phase," Shaw said. "Vera's cohort is in there, so is Boone's. So are approximately 53 other active service animals. 53 dogs whose full capabilities had been sitting in a classified file while their handlers worked around limitations that weren't real. 53 animals who had been asked to be less than they were because someone had decided that what they could do was inconvenient. "How long does the certification process take?" Mara asked. "For detection certification with documented training history, 4 to 8 weeks for evaluation and registry approval." Shaw paused. "Vera's case may move faster, given the federal incident, given that she broke a 14-month case," Mara said. "Yes, given that." Fain had already been in contact with the Canine Training Registry. The federal case file had been formally notated with Vera's alert as the precipitating detection event, and the registry had been informed that documentation was forthcoming through the IG's office. It was not seamless, it was the opposite of seamless. It was the grinding, imperfect, catch-as-catch-can process of institutions, trying to run fast enough to catch up to something that had already happened, but it was moving, and movement was enough. Mara thought about Vera finding the bag, the way she'd sat clean and square in the junction corridor, with the certainty of an animal that has no access to self-doubt. Detection is not a performance, it's not a display, just what you're built for, expressed without apology in the moment it's needed. Vera had been doing that work her whole career. The system just hadn't been set up to see it. That was the thing, Mara thought, that made her the most tired. Not Draper's choices, not the politics, not even the 11 years of buried files. It was the simpler thing beneath all of it, the number of times something real had been happening, and the official record had been arranged to look the other way. The number of times capable things had been called incapable because naming the capability was inconvenient for someone with the power to name things. You cannot manage the truth out of existence. You can delay it, you can classify it, bury it, tell two people who could verify each other that the other one is dead, and still the thing that is true keeps being true. Vera kept detecting. The dogs kept responding to a command structure nobody in their current unit could see, and Mara Bennett, trauma nurse, kept walking into rooms and seeing what was wrong with things. Truth is persistent. That's not inspiring, it's just a fact. The truth is stubborn and slow, and it waits, and eventually it turns up in a corridor where someone walked through the wrong door, and then the managing is over. At 10:30 p.m., Ethan found her in the K9 restroom. She was sitting on the floor near the door, not with the dog she'd kept her distance to let the unit settle without her, as the anchor just near the door, with her back against the wall, and her carry-on beside her and her shoes off, because she had been on her feet for 6 hours, and the shoes were not designed for 6 hours. Ethan came in and looked at her, and looked at the dogs, and then sat down on the floor beside her, which was either a gesture of solidarity or evidence that he was also done standing. "The formal incident report is complete," he said. "My report, Shaw's report, Decker's handler log, the federal incident file. Your name is in all of them. I know. The language Shaw used in her report to describe your intervention, I read it." He paused. "It's accurate, but it's also, it's significant language, kind that gets attention." He looked at the dogs. Boone was still on his side, breathing slowly, the hip wrap pale against his dark coat. Vera was still against him. Rook was across the room, stretched long, the dehydration finally and completely cleared from his posture. "The command staff at Fort Devlin is going to read it. Regional K9 Command is going to read it. The IG is going to read it in the context of everything else from today. And and I think you're going to get a commendation." He said it plainly. Not like a gift, like a forecast, not immediately. These things take time, but the documentation is there. Shaw filed it as a formal recommendation. Mara looked at the floor. "I don't need a commendation. I know you don't. But you're going to get one anyway, and I think you should." He paused. "Not because of what you used to be, because of what you today. Those are different things." She looked at him. "I spent the first 30 minutes of today treating you like a problem," he said. "I logged you as a civilian interference. I ordered you out of a corridor twice. Stood there while you did something that I didn't have the framework to understand, and instead of asking the question I should have asked, which was, why is this person calm when everyone else isn't? I tried to remove the anomaly." He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at Boone. "That's not a training failure. It's a judgment failure, and the record is going to reflect both what I did wrong and what you did right, which is the least I can do." "You also let Reyes give me the lead," Mara said. "That took me about 60 seconds longer than it should have." Still, he was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to be retrained." Shaw already put it in the recommendation, advanced canine leadership, updated protocols. Probably be at Fort Callum for 6 weeks in the spring. He paused. "I'm not appealing it. Good. I'm going to be better at this," he said. "Not as a performance, not as a conclusion to a lesson. Just as a statement of intent from a person who had understood something and had decided to do something about it, imperfectly, and without guarantee of perfect results, which was all any decision ever was." "I know you are," she said. The room was quiet. The dogs breathed. Outside the door, the distant machinery of Harwick International continued its business flights loading, flights landing, the constant movement of people going places, most of them through the right doors. At 11:15 p.m., Mara called Callaway Regional and talked to the charge nurse for her shift about the rebooking situation. She was going to need tomorrow off, which was going to cause logistical difficulty, which the charge nurse communicated with the particular strained professionalism of someone who was very annoyed and very good at not saying so directly. Mara apologized with the same professional restraint and did not explain, because the explanation would have taken longer than the conversation could hold. She rebooked the Portland flight for 2 days out, texted her friend, who responded in approximately 45 seconds with a string of messages that moved rapidly from relief to curiosity to a demand for details that Mara declined to provide via text message. She would be in Portland in 48 hours. Kovacs was in Portland. That was a conversation that would take more than 48 hours, but would have to start somewhere, and somewhere was better than the alternative, which was 11 more years of a managed story that said they were both gone. The IG's formal request for testimony arrived in her email at 11:48 p.m. It was thorough and specific and had a response window of 15 days, and it referenced several section numbers that indicated the review had been significantly escalated since its original filing. She read it twice, noted the questions that would require careful answer, and put her phone away. She was ready. At 7:30 the following morning, before she left the airport hotel where she'd spent a few hours in a room that smelled like recycled air and industrial detergent, Mara went back to the secured transit wing. K-9 unit was in the final stages of preparation for the transport decision. Boone had been cleared for ground transport to a nearer facility rather than the full flight, a compromise that got him to Fort Devlin without stressing the hip further, and the remaining 6 dogs had passed a morning health check that Shaw had ordered and that Decker had conducted with the focused thoroughness of someone who had upgraded his standards overnight. The handlers were different this morning. Not dramatically, people don't change dramatically overnight. That's not how people work. But in the specific way that people are different, after a day that reorganized something structural, They moved around the dogs with more attention and less assumption. They checked fit and hydration and the small behavioral cues without being told to. Decker had written something in his handler log that one of the other handlers had read, and she had written something similar in her own log, and the process of making that documentation was itself a small shift in what the unit was going to be. Ethan was there, in uniform, back in the full posture of a lieutenant operating in official capacity, but something had settled differently in his face from yesterday. He met her eyes when she came in, nodded, and went back to what he was doing, which was organizing the transport documentation with the detail-oriented focus of a man who had decided that precision was going to be the way he demonstrated that he'd understood. Shaw was at the checkpoint with a phone to each ear, which seemed to be her natural state. Mara went to Vera. The Malinois was in transport harness, lead clipped to Reyes's kit, standing in the easy alert posture of a working dog that is ready for whatever is next. She tracked Mara's approach with those steady dark eyes, and when Mara stopped in front of her, Vera's tail moved twice the same deliberate acknowledgement from the day before. Reyes was watching. "She's been calmer this morning," she said. "Since she was near Boone last night. She needed an anchor." "Yeah." Reyes looked at Vera with the expression of someone who was rebuilding their understanding of the animal they worked with every day. "I read her records this morning. Everything we had." She paused. "There's not much." "There's going to be more," Mara said. "Give it a few weeks." Reyes looked at her. "You really think the certification comes through?" "I think Vera earned it yesterday," Mara said. "The paperwork is catching up." Crouched down in front of Vera, all the way this time knees on the floor, eye level. The full reduction in posture that says, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." Vera looked at her with the calm, whole attention of an animal that has no pretension, no management, no version of itself to perform. Just present, just what she was. "You did good work," Mara told her. Quiet, direct, the specific register she'd used for 11 years in a program that no one was supposed to remember. Vera put her chin on Mara's knee. It was a small thing. A dog resting her chin on someone's knee. The kind of thing that happens constantly in the world between people and animals, unremarkable and unremarked upon. And it was also the specific gesture of a working dog who has found something she was looking for and is settling into the relief of having found it. Mara stayed in that position for 30 seconds. Then she stood up, and Vera straightened up with her, and they were both back to being what they were, in the public record, a military working dog in transport harness, and a civilian nurse with a delayed connecting flight. Shaw had finished her calls. She came across the transit wing with the particular stride of someone who has information that is moving in the right direction and has enough experience to not celebrate that until it has fully arrived. "Draper gave his full statement to the IG last night," she said. 3 hours. His legal counsel was present, and he went on record about the program closure rationale, the file classification decisions, and the suppression of the detection capability documentation. She paused. "He named the retired 3-star. Mara absorbed this. "He named him. On record. The IG's office is now in contact with the defense advisory boards that individual serves on." Shaw's voice was completely neutral, which was how she carried significant information. "His post-service arrangements are under review." The man who had decided 11 years ago that a program that produced results he found inconvenient should be closed and forgotten, whose name Mara had known for 11 years, whose decision she had lived with for 11 years, whose choice answered something she had given 8 years of her life to, and then scattered the people who'd built it to separate lives in separate cities, where they were told each other was gone, was now the subject of a formal review by the office with the authority to follow that decision to its consequences. It was not a perfect outcome. It was not a clean outcome. The man in question was in his 70s and had decades of service before the decision that was now under examination, and institutions moved slowly, and accountability in those institutions moved slower still. But it was moving, it had been named. It was in the record, which meant it was real, in a way that things need to be real to have weight. Tired 3-star, Mara said. What's his name? Shaw told her. She had known the name for 11 years. She had said it, in her own mind, in the specific way you say the name of a decision that changed your life, more times than she could count. Hearing it spoken aloud in this corridor, in this context, with this weight behind it, felt different from all the times she had said it to herself. Felt specific, grounded, like something that had been floating had been pinned to a surface where it could be examined. Okay, she said, that was all. Not catharsis, not release, just the quiet acknowledgement of a fact landing in its correct place. That was what justice actually felt like, she thought. Not a rush, not a reversal. Just a thing that had been true for a long time finally being treated as true by the machinery that was supposed to care about truth. At 9:45 a.m., with the K-9 unit in final transport staging and the federal incident file formally complete, and her new flight 2 hours from departure, Mara was at the checkpoint when Ethan came to find her. He had something in his hand. A standard military acknowledgement form not official yet, he explained. That would come through proper channels in the coming weeks. But Shaw had drafted it, and he had signed it, and he wanted Mara to have the draft while the official version was processed. It documented her intervention, Vera's detection alert, and the series of events that had led to the federal custody and the IG file escalation. The bottom in Shaw's precise handwriting was a formal recommendation for civilian commendation pending IG review completion. And below that, in different handwriting, Ethan's, she recognized it from the tablet he'd been carrying yesterday, a personal addendum that was not part of the official form, but that he had written on the bottom of the page anyway, which said, "The judgment I exercised in this corridor on August 18th did not reflect the experience or capability of the person I was speaking to. The record reflects this. My future conduct will reflect it." It was signed with his name and rank. She looked at it for a moment. "You didn't have to write that part," she said. "I know. He said it the same way he'd said it before, about the log amendment. I did it anyway." She folded the form carefully and put it in her carry-on bag, not in the outside pocket, but the inner one, the one where she kept things that were going to matter. They walked toward the departure level without talking for a while. The airport had moved into its mid-morning rhythm, a different crowd from yesterday's. New flights, new transactions, people with different destinations and different reasons for being in motion. Nobody in this terminal knew that the day before, in a restricted corridor on the transit level, a woman who was supposed to be invisible had spoken one word and changed the arc of several lives. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. "Security checkpoint," she stopped. "Listen to the dogs," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Whatever you take from this week as a handler, as an officer, as someone who's going to be responsible for other people's animals." She looked at him steadily. "Listen to the dogs. They're not equipment. They're not metrics. They're beings doing the specific work they were built to do, and they know things before you do. And if you build your judgment on top of that instead of over it, you'll be better at every part of this job." Quiet for a moment. "Is that what K-SOP taught you?" "SOP taught me the formal version," she said. 11 years of being a trauma nurse taught me that it's true everywhere. People know things before they can say them. Animals know before people do. The information is there. You just have to be willing to receive it instead of manage it." She paused. "Most of the mistakes I've seen in medicine, in the field, in every high-pressure situation I've ever stood in, they weren't failures of skill. They were failures of listening. Someone knew something, and somebody with authority decided that what they knew was inconvenient." Ethan was quiet with that for a long moment. It went somewhere specific in his face, the place where things go when they connect to more than just the immediate situation. "I'll remember that," he said. "Good," she said. She went through the checkpoint. Her flight boarded at 11:20. She found her seat, put her carry-on in the overhead, and sat down with the specific physical relief of a person who has been standing and moving and holding things up for a very long time, finally receiving the permission to stop. Her body felt every hour of the previous day in the specific, unambiguous language that bodies use when they're done, pretending they're not tired. She looked out the window at the tarmac. Somewhere on the service road below the terminal, a ground transport vehicle was carrying Boone to a veterinary facility where his hip would be properly managed, where someone would document his recovery, where he would rest in a space that was not a corridor floor. In the transit wing, Vera and the remaining 6 dogs were beginning the final staging for their delayed flight, now properly documented, properly assessed, properly understood by the people responsible for them. Decker was probably checking water levels again. Reyes was probably talking to Vera in the specific quiet way she'd started doing yesterday, feeling her way toward a handler-animal relationship that had just been reorganized by 36 hours of truth. The IG review would take months. The certification process would take weeks. The retired 3 stars review would take as long as it took, which might be long, which might be imperfect, which was the nature of accountability in institutions that were built by people and therefore carried all the limitations that building something with people always carries. Draper had done the right thing eventually. That was not absolution. It was just information about what people are capable of when the managing runs out and they're left with what they actually did. Kovacs was alive and in Portland and had spent 6 weeks feeding the truth into the right channels while Mara had spent those same 6 weeks working a trauma unit at Callaway Regional and thinking he was dead, and they were going to have a conversation about all of that, which was going to be difficult and probably overlong, and would require coffee that was significantly better than vending machine quality. He was looking forward to it. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engines found their working pitch. Out the window, Harwick International began to recede the terminals, the transit wings, the service roads, and the freight lines. The whole enormous, complicated machinery of people moving from one place to another, most of them through the right doors. Mara thought about the gate attendant who had waved her through the maintenance access door, probably still at the desk, probably unaware of what that wave had set in motion. That was how these things worked, not through dramatic design, but through the accumulation of small moments, wrong doors and pulled leads, and one word spoken in a quiet voice that nobody in the room was supposed to understand. You can spend a long time trying to be invisible. You can set down the things you were good at and build a different life, and tell yourself that the previous version was sealed off, filed away, accessible only in the specific way that old things are accessible through memory, not through action. And you can be right about that mostly for a long time, until a dog recognizes you, until an animal built in a program that was supposed to not exist looks at you with the complete, uncalculating certainty of a being that only knows what is true, and you understand that you cannot manage your way out of what you actually are. Plane lifted off the tarmac with the specific lurch of weight becoming air, and Harwick International dropped away below. And Mara Bennett, trauma nurse, retired K9 specialist, person who had walked through a wrong door and stayed for the right reasons, closed her eyes. Conversation waiting for her in Portland. There was testimony to give in careful, thorough language, about 8 years of work that deserved to be on the record. There were 53 dogs whose full capabilities were about to stop being a secret. There was Vera's certification, incoming. There was Boone's recovery, ongoing. There was Ethan Cole at the beginning of a different way of doing his job, imperfectly, the way all beginnings are. And there was the quiet, persistent fact that she had done something yesterday that mattered, not because she had gone looking for importance, but because she had stopped when she was supposed to keep walking, and stayed when she was supposed to leave, and spoken when the room needed someone who knew the words. It was not a power she had been given. It was one she had built, over years in hard conditions, through the specific, unglamorous work of learning things so well that they become part of how you move through the world. People who had tried to make that work disappear had not understood what they were dealing with. You cannot classify competence out of existence. You cannot manage capability into silence. You can bury the file, but the file is not the thing. The thing is in the person. The thing is what the person does when the corridor goes wrong and the dogs are pulling, and someone with authority tells them to leave. The woman that Lieutenant Ethan Cole had tried to remove from a restricted corridor had not needed his permission to matter. She had never needed anyone's permission to matter. She had needed a wrong door and a shepherd that recognized something old and true, and the simple, unglamorous willingness to stay. She was going to Portland. The clouds came up below the window and covered the city, and the plane leveled out into the clear air above them, and Mara opened her eyes and looked at nothing in particular, and she was already thinking about what she was going to say to the IG. She knew exactly what to say. She had always known.